Hey guys, this is Yahuda Lee again with another book review. For those of you that have looked at the videos that I did on the two Babylons, well, I did that to lead up to this particular book that I'm going to review right here. It's called The Meaning of the Dead Sea Scrolls by Powell Davies. Anyway, so I am kind of excited that I was able to get a hold of this book because I was always curious about the Dead Sea Scrolls, and I realized that this author, this is his opinion, but it kind of shed some light on some things and gave a new perspective on Christianity. And for those of you that are coming or listening to my channel for the first time, I will state emphatically I am not a Christian any longer. I was once upon a time, but just got an awakening and began to challenge some of the things that were being taught within the Christian church. So anyway, so I was just, like I said, excited to be able to get this book. And it's not a long book, maybe 135 pages or so, and it's short, so it's an easy read, but there are some nuggets in here. And just by the front cover, you should see a guy or shepherd or whomever standing there, and above his head you got the Star of David, and you got a cross up on that hill. And it's just very interesting how both of those are together. And this book doesn't go that much into the Star of David, but for those of you that know your history concerning the beginning of these religions, it shouldn't surprise you that the author decided to put artwork where the Star of David as well as the Christian cross is in one pic together, kind of showing the relationship. But anyway, so I got this book. It was in my father's library. I can't remember if he's ever read it, but well, I know he hasn't talked to me about it. But anyway, so this particular book was written in 1956, and it's broken up into several chapters. Again, I'm not going to review the entire book because that would be a waste of my time and yours, but I want to highlight a few things in this book. But concerning the I'm going to be jumping around, but I want you to know the contents of this book and how it's broken out. So the first chapter begins talking about the discovery of the scrolls. The second chapter is the dating of the scrolls. The third is the sect, S-E-C-T, of the scrolls. Chapter 4 is the scrolls and the Christian origins. And chapter 5 is the scrolls and Jesus. Okay. I am, like I said, I'm not going to review the whole book, but because I'm going to be jumping around, I'll try to bridge the gap between what I'm reading and what I've skipped. And again, I'm not skipping to hide anything. I'm just skipping for the sake of time. So anyway, let's jump right into it because there's something near the middle or back that I really want to throw out there, or at least read and have you think about it. Especially for those of you that are Christians, or for those of you that are on the fence of whether or not to remain in that religion. It's just something to think about. Anyway, so I'm going to start off in the first chapter, and that is the discovery of the scrolls. So anyway, again, the title of this book is The Meaning of the Dead Sea Scrolls, all right, by Powell Davies. Anyway, so let's begin. So it says, fragments rediscovered included, the fragments of the scrolls, fragments recovered included some from the books of the Old Testament and the Old Testament Apocrypha, and some which were not identifiable since they belonged to books unknown. From the summer of 1949 onwards, fragments of leather were brought to Bedouins to Jerusalem, with writing not only in Hebrew but also in Greek. These were said to come from a cave not in the Kuram vicinity. The continuous flow of the fragments was a clear indication of the need for new explorations, and this led, in 1952, to an expedition to the caves of the Wadi Marabaat, about 11 miles south of the Wadi Kuram. Here, a considerable store of fragments and many coins were discovered. Some of the fragments were from the biblical scrolls, others from the 2nd century A.D. There was evidence that these caves had been occupied not only during the period when the jars had been placed in the cave at the Wadi Kuram, but at several other times, including the period of the Jewish revolt in 132 through 135 A.D., led by Simon Bar Kokhba. Okay, so this just talks about the finding of the scrolls and the back and forth in terms of were they legit, what they actually were, things of that nature. So that particular section I read there was just talking about, I guess, a cave that the scrolls were being found in, or that what they were found in, and again, like I said, were they legit? Okay. All right. So let's see. Here we go. Still in the same chapter. So when some of the tombs in the cemetery were open, so this was a cemetery within the caves. When some of the tombs in the cemetery were open, it was found that the same method of burial had been uniformly used, except that sometimes a flat stone was employed instead of an unbaked brick to cover the head of the corpse. It was also observed that some of the skeletons were female, which tended to throw doubt upon the possibility that the community of the monastery was Essene, since the Essenes were believed to be celibate. However, we know from the Jewish historian Josephus that there was an order of Essenes which did practice marriage, and that in this sect women were also admitted to the daily baptism. From the presence of layer of ashes, it can be deducted that the monastery was destroyed by fire, which, as we shall later see, probably occurred during the war which resulted in the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 A.D. Knowing that the Romans would attack the monastery, the community placed its manuscripts in jars. Perhaps this was their usual practice in any case, and took them to the caves for safekeeping. All right, so what I want to focus on is the Essenes. We'll get on it later, but that's these are the nuggets concerning this basic review that I want to talk about. Excuse me. All right. So let's see. Section 6. Okay. So this particular section is still in the chapter 1, Discovery of the Scrolls. This is titled The Significance of the Discovery Ignored by New Testament Scholars. Excuse me, I got the hiccups. Until recently, the Dead Sea Scrolls have been largely ignored by the majority of New Testament scholars. The Catholic magazine, Commonweal, December 9, 1955, suggests that the reason may be that many of them did not have an adequate training in Hebrew and a Semitic background necessary to handle these texts. In view of the importance of what is involved, this is surely an insufficient reason. Whatever technical qualifications the New Testament scholars lacked could readily have been supplied by Semitic specialists among their colleagues, which have also been there have also been, since 1948, an ever-increasing number of informative articles in the archaeological and biblical journals which New Testament scholars are supposed to read. Many of the questions at issue could even have been evaluated by consulting standard reference sources such as the biblical encyclopedias. In any case, it was a situation that could not continue. Largely due to the long article in the New Yorker magazine dated May 14, 1955, written by Mr. Edmund Wilson, the general public became interested in the scrolls. The New Testament scholars had to begin to say something. And what some of them said was that they do not think much of Mr. Wilson. He is not a scholar, he is only a reporter. What they neglect to mention is that he is a very good reporter and that he has transmitted quite correctly what the experts who have been working on the scrolls have come to think about them. Indeed, the conclusion is inescapable that the real difficulty with the New Testament scholars have been experiencing with Mr. Wilson lies precisely in his unexpected competency. Theodore A. Gill, one of the editors of the Christian Century, October 26, 1955, whimsically complains of this in a review of Mr. Wilson's books, The Scrolls from the Dead Sea, which repeats his New Yorker article at slightly greater length. Mr. Wilson's remarkable faculty for walking without stumbling, where even scholars are known to zigzag a bit, Mr. Gill finds rather frightening. Of course it is frightening. Mr. Wilson has no creedal preconceptions to guard, no dogmatic pattern that must somehow or other be found to fit the shape of history. New Testament scholars have also attacked the great French scholar, Professor A. Dupont Sumer of the University of Paris. Here they cannot say what they do about Mr. Wilson, since M. Dupont Sumer is a foremost authority and the extent of his learning has to be acknowledged. But they find that his hypothesis too bold, too challenging to cherished preconceptions. Yet he is merely proceeding upon findings which other experts who have worked on the scrolls completely concur. Professor William F. Albright, for instance, of Johns Hopkins University, who has done preeminent work in establishing the dates of the scrolls, expressed his view as follows. The new evidence with regard to the beliefs and practices of Jewish sectarians of the last 2 centuries BC bids fair to revolutionize our approach to the beginnings of Christianity. It is interesting that this statement by Dr. Albright has apparently not brought him much criticism, but when Professor Dupont Sumer made a similar statement, it was regarded as shocking. He said, all the problems relative to primitive Christianity henceforth find themselves placed in a new light, which forces us to reconsider them completely. M. Dupont Sumer says, reconsider completely. Dr. Albright says, bids fair to revolutionize. In any case, there is concurrence, and among the many distinguished scholars who have been working on the scrolls, these two must be numbered with the most eminent. New Testament scholars are furthermore saying that it is too early yet to draw any inferences from this newly available material. We must wait until more is known and understood about it, perhaps for 50 years. This is indeed an amiable suggestion. In 50 years, our present New Testament scholars will no longer be teaching and can hand on the problems of the scrolls to their unfortunate successors. Excuse me. The fact is that it is perfectly possible to interpret the main significance of these documents already. And whenever a particular hypothesis, based upon the new knowledge, proves wrong, it can be corrected as soon as there is a cause for it. It is true that the reconstruction of our detailed view of Christian origins will take considerable time and will involve, no doubt, prolonged debate. But that is a matter of reason for beginning the procedure than for postponing it. As for the contention that further discoveries may be made or new evaluations arrived at, modifying current ones, this will always be so, and those who care above all for truth will have no fear of new knowledge and will not hesitate to make revisions. It is notable that while the New Testament scholars have been reluctant to acknowledge the importance of the Dead Sea Scrolls, there have been increasing signs of unusual popular interest. In one way, This is rather surprising since the significance of the discovery can only be readily understood by those whose training has equipped them to understand it. But evidently the layman is not to be deterred. He senses that there is something of consequence in this discovery, and if at all possible, he is determined to know what it is. It can be said at once that he is right. The discovery is important. It is not, however, as novel in its consequences as many people think. Scholarship, when not constrained by dogma, has long since arrived at findings just as radical as those of the Dead Sea Scrolls are indicating. But the scrolls have tangibility, and the implications cannot so easily be overlooked. It has long been known, for instance, that Christianity is largely composed of elements absorbed from pagan religion in the Mediterranean area during the early centuries of its development. Even the Jewish Sabbath, which both Jewish and Gentile Christians at first observed on the seventh day, was given up in favor of the Mithraic Sunday, the first day of the week. To these matters we shall return in a later chapter, merely remarking in the meanwhile that there is no reason why they should be matters which are understood only by the relative few. All right. So again, it's this book. Well, that particular section is talking about the back and forth between these supposed scholars on whether the Dead Sea Scrolls were authentic. Should they be acknowledged? Because again, during that time, I guess it was discovered in 49, the ball of Christianity, if you allow me to say that, had already started. And like I said, or like this particular said, there are questions about the beginnings of it. And just to reiterate, it says, it's been long known that Christianity is largely composed of elements absorbed from pagan religion in the Mediterranean area during the early centuries of its development. And I touched on that in my series, The Two Babylons. And just go check it out. Just go check it out because it puts a lot into perspective in terms of some of the customs that we are doing today. And that's one of the reasons why I just had to get out of that whole ball of wax that I'll call Christianity. And again, I'm not saying that to be offensive, but when you begin to research, you'll begin to realize some things that have been going on that are not of the Most High. Anyway, so I'm going to be skipping quite a lot now. So now I am in the section called the Sect, S-E-C-T, of the Scrolls. And this third chapter is pretty much the meat of the book. All right. This is chapter 3, page 65, near the middle of the page, and I'll show a screenshot. Anyway, so it says Josephus likens the Essenes. Remember, we talked about the Essenes. Oh, that's who I want to talk about. Josephus likens the Essenes to the Pythagoreans, a semi-religious order founded by Pythagoras, a Greek philosopher and mathematician, in 520 BC, thus suggesting Hellenic influence. The Essenes may also be likened to the Therapeutae of Alexandria, who, however, were more given to mysticism and contemplation. The question of the possible extent to which Greek ideas entered into Essenic thinking has often been discussed, but with no very certain conclusion. It is known from the books of the Maccabees that kinship had been claimed between the Spartans and the Jews as far back as 309 BC, when Arius, the king of Sparta, had written to the high priest Onius that it is found in writing that the Spartans and the Jews are brethren, and that they are of a stock of Abraham. Let me read that one more time for those of you that are familiar with the movie 300. Let me read that one more time for you guys. It is known from the book of Maccabees that kinship had been claimed between the Spartans, that's us, and the Jews, that's us, as far back as 309 BC, when Arius, the king of Sparta, had written to the high priest Onius that it is found in the writing that the Spartans and the Jews are brethren, and that they are of the stock of Abraham. Okay, so if you want to be really dogmatic, then I guess he's making a distinction between Sparta and the Jews, i.e. the Jews are from the lineage of Israel, and anybody from Abraham could be from Isaac, Ishmael, and the sons of Keturah. But anyway, the Sparta, those are our brothers. They are not pale skin as you see in the movies. They are dark skinned people. But anyway, that's not my point for doing this review. Going back. So, and that was 1 Maccabees 12, verse 21. So again, in 144 BC, the highest priest, Jonathan, reminded the Spartans that the long-standing friendship between the Spartans and the Jews was based on ancient kinship. This is certainly astonishing information, but it must not for that reason be set aside. Possibly the Hellenizing party among the Jews desired to establish a reference point, however mythical, to foster close ties to Judaic and Greek relations. The curious element of the Essenic ritual, according to Josephus, was worship of the sun. Remember that, guys. Let me reread that. A curious element of the Essenic ritual, according to Josephus, was the worship of the sun, to which they prayed at dawn. This practice, prayed at dawn, this practice was probably adopted from Zoroastrian or Mithriac religion. Other elements of Essenic doctrine, as, for instance, the belief in angels, undoubtedly come from Persia and were probably absorbed during exile. After the prayer of the sun at daybreak, the Essenes, Josephus tells us, were sent away by their superintendents to their appointed work, according to the arts in which they were skilled, and in this they remained employed until the 5th hour. They then assembled in one place, clothed themselves in white vestments, and bathed in cold water. This sacrament of purification being completed, they entered the exclusive refectory, into which no one not of their order was ever admitted, and partook of a common meal presided over by a priest. This was followed by the singing of thanksgiving psalms, after which the sacred vestments were set aside and they returned to their work. At the end of the day, the evening meal was solemnized with similar observances, no one being given more to eat than the minimum that would sustain them. To join the sect, it was necessary to serve a novitiate of 1 year, subject to all the disciplines of the order, but without being admitted to its privileges. At the end of this period, if the novice had given proof of his worthiness, he was permitted to share more closely to the sectarian way of life and to use a more sacred water of purification. After 2 years, if admitted, he took tremendous oaths. 1, to reverence God, because that's not our Most High. 2, to be just towards men. And 3, to hate the wicked. Other oaths were to respect those in authority, to exercise authority justly if he himself were vested with it, to wear simple clothing, to love truth and abjure falsehood, to abstain from all unholy gain, to conceal nothing from the members of the order, to communicate the doctrine of the sect only as he had received it, to preserve the scriptures of the sect, and never to reveal the names of the angels, used perhaps in incantations. All right. So that one part, to preserve the scriptures of the sect. All right. So remember that when you think about the Dead Sea Scrolls, because the Essenes were definitely well versed in the testaments of our forefathers. In addition, the name of Moses must be reverenced next to that of Jehovah. Death was the penalty for blaspheming against Moses. We see from this how intensely Jewish this how intensely Jewish the sect was, and yet they also accepted the non-Jewish belief in immortality of the soul. The typical Jewish expectation had been concerned with all Israel, and its characteristic context was terrestrial. The Essenes, however, to quote Josephus, in agreement with the opinions of the Greeks, declare that there lies away across the ocean a habitation for the good souls, but they allot to the bad souls a dark and tempestuous den full of never-ceasing punishments. It will be noted that Josephus's description of the Essenes, at least as to the details of the ritual, would aptly better to a monastic sect such as Pliny tells us was located near the Dead Sea than it would to a widespread movement with the branches in many cities. The daily baptism of a considerable group by immersion in sanctified water would seem to be more feasible where elaborate arrangements could be made for it, as at the monastery, than under conditions prevailing in cities where water was not plentiful, but must usually be taken from the springs or drawn from wells and carried to the points where it had been used. Nevertheless, it is clear that Josephus knew the Essenes as a widespread movement, a party that had, as he says, no single city. The only reasonable explanation is that the Essenic sects, perhaps with a total party, which was loosely called the Essenes, the Holy Ones, or the Saints, exhibited considerable variety in their practices, as they may also have done in their doctrines. With this view in mind, we shall examine the relation of the Essenes to the sect of the Dead Sea Scrolls. All right. This section is called "What Happened to the Essenes." All right, and it's going to be a lot of name dropping, but bear with me. It's pretty good. All right. So it says the Roman occupation of Judea was for a while fairly quiet. Roman rulers were in many ways as just as they were rapacious, and in any case, they were scarcely greedier than the native kings. Antigonus, the last of the Macedonian line, was succeeded in 37 BC by Herod, who was called the Great. Herod built many splendid buildings, founded the seaport of Caesarea, and began the restoration of the temple, which, however, was not completed until 64 AD, 6 years before it was again destroyed. When he died in 4 BC, there were few who sincerely mourned him. After Herod, the kingdom was divided. Antipas, who ruled in Galilee, married his brother's wife and was rebuked by John the Baptist, who he executed. When he was defeated in battle by Aretas, the father of his first wife, whom he had put away, the people regarded it as a punishment for decapitating John. He ruled until 34 AD. In Judea, Archelaus reigned for 10 years until 6 AD, but his rule was so bad that Augustus removed him and turned Judea into a Roman province under a procurator of low rank who reported to the governor of Syria. One of the procurators was Pontius Pilate, who held this office from 26 to 36 AD, after which he was recalled and banished to Gaul. The tension between the Jewish people and their Roman rulers gradually increased. The Romans were not able to understand what looked to them like demented religious fanaticism, and the Jews were not able to tolerate what they counted sacrilege. Jew was disdainful of Roman. Roman was contemptuous of Jew. Pilate was bewildered and outraged at the resistance of the Jews to the Roman military enzymes being brought into Jerusalem. It was done elsewhere as a matter of routine. Why not in Judea? For the charge of idolatry he had neither comprehension nor patience. But since his choice was between retreat or more bloodshed than he cared to report to Rome, he retreated. The emperor, Caligula, directed that his statue be set up in the Jerusalem temple. Beseeched by Herod Agrippa, he rescinded the order, but would probably have reissued it if, in the meanwhile, he had not been assassinated. Agrippa, who died in 44 AD, was the last king of the Jews. After that, all Palestine was under direct Roman rule. Because of the frequent recourse of the governor, Antonius Felix, to mass crucifixions, there arose a sect called Sicarii, who made life in Jerusalem hazardous for all Romans by their skill in assassination. Felix did what he could to suppress the Sicarii, but also employed them to murder the high priest Jonathan, who had been a moderating influence and whose death was a tragic loss. Porcius Festus succeeded Felix but died after 2 years. During this time, what was happening in Kiram and to the Essenic party generally, we do not know. But we do know that what came to be known as the Christian movement had by now developed, and that was similar in many of its doctrines as it was in its sacraments and its organization to the Essenic sects and the new covenants of Qumran. The Christians may not as yet, 62 AD, may not as yet have been generally known by that name. More usually they were known as the sect of the Nazarenes. But to this we shall come to the next chapter, noting only in the present summary that after the death of Festus and before a new governor could arrive, the high priest Ananus seized the opportunity to assassinate James, the brother of Jesus and head of the Nazarene movement, for which Ananus was disposed by Agrippa. Sorry, I'm not saying this guy's name because that was actually commanded to us. Say no names of other gods. Anyway, Judean affairs by now were not only bad, they had reached the point of social disillusion. Brigandage was strife. No one remained in jail who could afford the bribe that bought his release. Responsible government was at end. Josias Florus, who ruled from 64 to 66 AD, proceeded from routine murder to frequent massacre, and at last was driven by the populace of Jerusalem, where the Roman garrison surrendered but was nevertheless put to death. This was rebellion and the signal for war. The Christians, who by this time saw little to choose between the Romans and the Sadducean priests, fled from Judea across the Jordan, taking no part in the Jewish revolt. It is said that there were Essenes who also would not fight, but whether the two groups were connected, we can only speculate. That there were Essenes who did not fight, at least in the revolt, has frequently been asserted, but the testimony upon which the assertion is chiefly based, that of Josephus, speaks only of valiantly suffering torture. To meet the crisis, the Jews formed an emergency government and placed Josephus, destined to achieve greater fame as an historian than a soldier, in charge of the defense of Galilee. He fought stoutly but was defeated and went over to the Romans. The Pharisees, who had controlled the emergency government down to now, and who had tried to invoke a policy of moderation, were brushed aside. Josephus was a Pharisee and was believed to have been half-hearted in the struggle. He had now gone over to the enemy. Angrily, the reckless zealots took over, and moderation was at end. If Israel had been united and less eaten away by corruption, the war need not have been a hopeless one. But as it was, it could end in only one way. Jerusalem was torn by factional strife. Jews massacred Jews, and the slaughter reviled all the butcheries of the Romans. In the late summer of 70 AD, the outer court of the temple was set afire, but the fighting went on even around the altar of burnt offering. At last it was all over. The site where Zadok had stood to offer sacrifice, and upon which one temple after another had been erected, was left, as Jesus had predicted. I'll just say JC. Uh, as JC had predicted, that it would be with not one stone upon another. As calamity followed calamity, the Quorum monastics may well have believed that the day of Jehovah had at last arrived, that the Messiah for whom they had waited would immediately appear. The moon, it was true, had not yet turned into blood, nor had the stars fallen from the sky, but destruction had come to the evil ones who had ruled in Israel. And it was time now for Jehovah to turn his hand against Kittim. Again, I'm not reading that name because I don't think that's the proper name of the Most High, but that's my belief. Anyway, perhaps they waited until almost the last moment, but they knew the Romans would come. They put their precious manuscripts into the jars prepared for them and climbed laboriously up to the caves. Here the Romans would never think to search. Someday, perhaps when the fighting was over, the Covenanters would come back. Perhaps they thought it would be soon. Surely the time was near. The Most High could not wait, not now. The new age must begin. The time had come. The sons of Belial had had their day. Jehovah must fulfill his promise. His faithful would not doubt it. And when they returned, their scriptures still would be their treasure, perhaps more so than ever. When the Messiah of Aaron and of Israel presided over their sacred meal, in the day of the Most High and the kingdom that came from the Most High. Okay? So that was just talking about things that were in power. So basically, there was a lot of strife going on. The Christians had already begun to form as a religion. You had the Hellenists, you had the Zealots, so there were many different factions going on. Obviously, you had the Jews that still believed in the Old Testament and believed that the Most High was the only Most High. And again, the scriptures tell you that, there's no other Savior but Him. So you had all these different factions going on, and it became a struggle for power. And it seemed like the rulers were trying to rule while seeing which religious sect would dominate in order for them to make a move and say, hey, this is going to be the particular religion for all, or hey, I don't like the one that dominated, I'm going to change it. But anyway, so that's what was going on. All right, so now we are in the section of the scrolls and the Christian origins. This is chapter 4. So I'll read a brief passage here. Anyway, so it says, when theological scholars say, as they have recently been saying, that the discovery of the scrolls has brought them no information that obliges them to revise their view of Christian beginnings, or at least not extensively, it can be for them the truth. But they should go on to tell the laity in what sense it is the truth. What they mean, if they would express it more informatively, is that they have known for a long time that the traditional view of Christian origins is not supported by history so much as by theology. Let me reread that. What they mean, if they would express it more informatively, is that they know, or they have known for a long time, that the traditional view of Christian origins is not supported by history so much as by theology. Unlike the laymen, they are familiar with New Testament historical problems to which it has never been possible to find historical solutions. Dogmatic solutions are another matter. But what the layman thinks he is dealing with is trying to grasp the meaning of the scrolls is not theology, but history, not dogma, but fact. Theological scholars have been long aware, for instance, of the impossibility of knowing historically where JC was born, or when or by what means the portrait of him in the first 3 Gospels, the Synoptics, can be reconciled with the quite different portrait of him in the Gospel of John. This is only the beginning of the matter. Theological scholars know, again, as a layman usually does not, something of the extensive debt of Christianity to pagan religion during the first centuries of its development in the Mediterranean area. Theological scholars have known for some time that there were important resemblances between Essenic organizations and that of the early Christian churches, and have had reason to suspect that the two may have been organically connected. The information that comes to them with the discovery of the scrolls merely adds itself to this early information, and they say they are not disturbed. Perhaps not, at least not initially. But should not the layman, who has little, if any, knowledge of these matters, be given an opportunity to discover whether what is not disturbing to the theologian is disturbing to his own beliefs? Admittedly, the scrolls, in and of themselves and with no reference to previous knowledge, might not be revolutionary. But the previous knowledge exists. That is to say, it exists for scholars. Why should it not be imparted to laymen also? If the scholar has been able to accommodate himself to historical difficulties by recourse to dogmatic elements, perhaps the layman can do the same. And if not, truth is still a religious obligation. The disputed fourth gospel scarcely misleads us when it says, "The truth shall make you free." In the sections immediately following, therefore, we shall pursue our investigation by examining some of the information known to the scholars. Necessarily, this examination can do no more to disclose the general nature of the situation by exhibiting areas of it that are typical. But this will be enough, no doubt, to remove objections to the introduction of the considerations in the latter sections, in the light of which the reader can make his own evaluation of the scrolls. All right, so let me read this section. So it's still within the scrolls and the Christian origins. All right, so it says the truth or falsity of the main events recorded in the New Testament and the implication of those events, also as recorded in the New Testament, must be determined historically before there can be enough reality for Bible-based theology to rest upon. In other words, you cannot make Christian origins something that they may not have been merely by believing what you wish about them. You can make an imaginary world that way in which to live and to think, and through its symbols worship, but you are out of touch with the real world. So the case for theology as arbiter of history falls down. All right, so this is section 6, still within a chapter called The Scrolls and the Christian Origins. We have indicated that one of the effects of the Qumran discoveries has been the need to redate documents which were formerly thought to belonging in the Christian era. Wherever fragments of the manuscripts have been found in the cave, the documentary contents of which have been dated as to the time of their deposit, we know that the manuscript is at least as old as the time when it was placed in the cave. This is a different manuscript they're talking about. Through internal evidence that relates it to other documents, or which in some other way determines the chronological context in the light of the new discovery, we can arrive at the approximate period during which it was written. This has meant, as we have already observed, that the documents that we thought to be of Christian authorship have been found, in fact, to be Jewish. So, other words, closer to the Old Testament than the New. We shall now more specifically describe such documents and interpret the consequences of their redating. A book which has long been known to scholars and which has presented unusually perplexing problems bears the title Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs. You can get that in your Old Testament pseudepigrapha. It is one of the scriptures used by early Christians, but which it was decided to leave out of the Bible. Its form will seem rather strange to modern readers since it employs the device of presenting what has to say as though it were an anthology of final utterances of the 12 sons of Jacob of Israel. This sort of device, writing in the name of heroic personages of the former time, was not uncommon in the centuries immediately before and after the beginning of the Christian era. The Testaments, as transparently a production of this general period, but of which century? Scholars formerly thought that the Testaments were Jewish in their original form, but the extensive Christian interpolations and editing, they're writing themselves in. On this basis, however, parts of the document were utterly baffling. R.H. Charles, the greatest of all scholars in this field, called one chapter, that's Levi chapter 17, unintelligible. Indeed, it was considered as a Christian writing. There was no solution until fragments of the book were found in the caves. Its date being thus fixed, and its literary context much better known, we may now reconsider it and revise the former view of Christian interpolations. This has some rather important consequences. For one thing, we must acknowledge that when the document refers to Christ, it does not mean JC. As we have pointed out in a previous chapter, the word that in English we pronounce Christ is a translation of the Greek word Christos, which in turn translates the Hebrew word that we call Messiah. As we have previously emphasized, the word is not the name of a person, but the title of an office. A Messiah or anointed one could be any of a number of persons in the past or present or the future. A Hebrew king was an anointed one. His enthronement was accompanied by an anointing with oil, which had the significance of making him the Most High's elect, a sacred person. David, we remember, was unwilling to slay Saul, although he had been grievously provoked, and Saul was hunting him down to take his life. David's reason was that he could not face the guilt of having shed the blood of the Most High's anointed. In the 1st century BC, however, the anointed one had come to mean what we have understood as meaning in previous sections, the agent of the Most High who would appear at the ending of days to judge the world and establish a new order. But this was not any one person, to the exclusion of other possible persons. We are re-emphasizing this matter, even though we have pointed it out before, so that the reader will see clearly that in the 1st centuries BC and AD, JC was by no means the only person who could be meant by Christ. The scholars who worked on the testaments of the 12 patriarchs before the discoveries of the scroll did, however, suppose that Christ must be JC, and thus they were misled. One of the reasons why they thought JC must be the only possible person who could be meant was the Christian quality of the teaching that the book contained. They did not think it possible that teaching of this sort could emanate from any group earlier than the 1st century Christians. We must now see that the Christos of the Testaments, who could not have been JC, may very well have been the teacher of righteousness. But whether he was or not, the contents of the document, although owing nothing to Christianity, was used as a Christian source book. The Testaments and the letter of the Apostle Paul have so many points in common that Canon Charles, without benefit of the recently available information, remarked 40 years ago that St. Paul seemed to have used the book as a vade-mecum. Not only the letters of St. Paul, however, but the Gospels themselves have been influenced by the testaments of the 12 patriarchs. The following is an illustration. I was taken into captivity, and his strong hand succored me. I was beset with hunger, and the Most High nourished me. I was alone, and the Most High comforted me. I was sick, and the Most High visited me. I was in prison, and the Most High showed favor to me. In bonds, and he released me. That is from the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs, specifically Joseph, chapter 1, verses 5 through 6. Now this, for I was hungry, and ye gave me meat. I was thirsty, and ye gave me drink. I was a stranger, and ye took me in. Naked, and ye clothed me. I was sick, and ye visited me. I was in prison, and ye came unto me. That is St. Matthew's Gospel, chapter 25, verse 35. In the same way, the Testaments anticipated some verses in the Sermon on the Mount. There are differences in every case, but they are obviously differences by adaptation, differences by amendment. The dependency of the one document upon the other is too plain to admit of doubt. Again, let us turn to Canon Charles, the Sermon on the Mount. He says reflects in several instances the spirit, or even reproduces the way phrases of the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs. Since the Testaments go further than the scrolls towards what has been thought of as the specifically Christian ethical outlook, it has to be considered that Jewish teaching, at least in some of the sects, developed to a point where it approached and paralleled the later Christian teaching, and to an extent that made it an important recourse for Christian writers, such as those who composed the Gospels in their original form, and the Apostle Paul. It is true that we knew already of such noble-minded teachers and Pharisees, Rabbi Hillel, but what we know now directly connects the Jewish and Christian teachings in a way that raises the question as to whether, in this respect, Christianity was merely indebted to Judaism, or was not in fact the organic part of it until the Gentile church was founded. At the very least, as Professor Dupont Sumner has put it, the Christian tree only grew so far and so vigorously because the soil in which it was germinated had been so marvelously worked. Excuse me. But this is indeed the least, for it seems more and more possible that at the beginning, Essenic Judaism and Palestinian Christianity were one and the same plant. Let us turn, however, to another non-biblical document of equal importance with the Testaments for the understanding of early Christianity. This is the Didache, or teaching of the 12 apostles. Here, as in the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have the two ways, the way of darkness and the way of the light. The Greek version of the Didache contains references that are clearly Christian, but a Latin version is known that omits many of these references. The documents from the Latin version was translated, therefore the document from which the Latin version was translated, therefore did not have them either. The Greek one must have been a Christian revision. When scholars studied the Latin version, they concluded that it could not be a Jewish source since it had no Jewish prototype. Otherwise, they would have called it Jewish. Now, of course, there is a Jewish prototype. The Didache belongs with the same literature as the Dead Sea Scrolls, but appears to have been edited by early Christians, writing themselves in again. It contains not only language and ideas familiar to us in the Christian scriptures, but also baptism after fasting, and rather curious versions of the sacramental meal. The sacred wine, the Didache tells us, represents the holy vine of the Most High's son David. The bread symbolizes the life and knowledge made known through JC, which is supposedly the Most High's son. Do we have here a possible link between JC and the Essenes? The wine represents the Jewish king David, and the bread of the Jewish prophet JC, who was called the son of David. Can this be the way in which the Essenic sacrament, at least in some of the sects, made room for JC? It will be noted that instead of the messiahs of Aaron and Israel, we now have David and a Davidic Messiah. Was this a variant preferred by some of the sects that did not seek a priestly Messiah, but only a Messiah of Israel? Surely, what the new knowledge is revealing to us is the natural, historical evolution of Christianity from a branch of Judaism which preceded it. In another non-biblical but important document, the Shepherd of Hermas, which formerly was regarded as Christian but with inexplicable features, such as the fact that JC is nowhere mentioned, although there is a lot of what seems to be Christian theology, we have a further document from Essenic sources. The Catholic Church at one time regarded this book as canonical, then later changed its mind. So close is it to Christian reading, but we see now that JC is not mentioned in it because its author did not know of JC, or if he did not regard him as the Messiah or the Son of the Most High that he speaks of. Once more, the question may be raised. Is the reference to the Essenic teacher of righteousness? We cannot at present answer these questions that point to the teacher of righteousness. Perhaps we shall never be able to answer them, but we can certainly answer the question as to whether Essenic and Palestinian Christian religion belong together. Here in The Shepherd is a book that the Catholic Church was so sure was Christian that for a long time it was included in the canon. It reflected, so it seemed, Christian theology, but it was Judaic, one of the books of the movement that produced both the New Covenants called Essenes and the similar New Covenanters who came to be known as Christians. Once again, we ask, was the relationship closer than this? Were there two merely similar groups, or until the coming of the Gentile Christianity, were they one and the same? Was there any one difference between the first Christians and the Essenes than is conveyed by the exchangeable terms, the New Testament and the New Covenant? We shall ask this question more precisely later on. Okay. All right, so let me read this one section, and I should pretty much wrap it up for this book. All right. So, still in the chapter called The Scrolls and Christian Origins, we are in section 8, and it's titled Some Questions That Invite New Answers. One of the consequences of the new knowledge which has come into our possession with the Qumran discoveries, and which is still accumulating, is the way in which it revises our understanding of events and circumstances in the New Testament narrative. Although as yet more questions are raised and answered, they are questions that in themselves imply a changed viewpoint. What in the past was so often silhouetted against a blank backboard is suddenly seen in its natural context. Although this does not mean that we are immediately able to establish a firm relationship between an event or discourse and this new context, it does mean that in many cases we can see indications clearly enough to suggest that they be explored. In taking up some of these indications in this and the following section, we ask the reader to remember what is said at the beginning of the chapter, that we are not protagonists of a particular hypothesis or anxious that suggested explanations be sustained. We are eager only that there be an honest effort, diligent and responsible, but not held back by an excessive reverence or tradition, to give to what is told us in the canonical scriptures its most natural and probable interpretation. What follows merely illustrates what the approach of such an effort might be. What are we to say, for instance, in the light of our new knowledge of John the Baptist to the Gospels, who the Gospels tell us was brought up in the desert, the wilderness of Judea? Can we any longer imagine him wandering about, sustaining himself somehow in solitude in the unrelieved desolation of this wilderness, and then coming forth and preaching a doctrine that is only coincidentally familiar to that of the Covenanters, whose monastery was in the area where John is reported to have lived. Where did John get his ideas and his ascetic practices and his baptism? Is it true that he departed from the ideas of the Dead Sea sect, but it is also true that he had to have some ideas from which some make departures? Where else shall we look when the evidence points so plausibly to the Qumran monastery? That John was, in the broader sense of the term, an Essene can scarcely be doubted. Let me repeat that, because remember we talked about the Essenes earlier in this presentation. We talked about how they worshiped the sun. They were a secret sect. They had these daily baptisms, and go back to my series on the two Babylons where we talk about baptism, or the supposed cleansing by the water. So let me read that paragraph again. Where else shall we look when the evidence points so plausibly to the Qumran monastery that John was, in the broader sense of the term, an Essene can scarcely be doubted? In this same broader sense, were not his followers also numbered with the Essenes? J.C. was baptized by John the Baptist. Some of his disciples were drawn from John's following. Can J.C. any more than John be thought of as having been unconnected with the Essenic communities before he decided that John's version of the Messianic faith was the one that he was ready to adopt? Just as J.C. later made considerable departures from John's emphasis, had not John previously made similar departures from the emphasis of the community to which he had belonged? We say had belonged, but actually we are not entitled to assume that John had left this community or had been expelled from it because of non-conforming practices, any more than we need to assume that in establishing his own teaching, J.C. had made a definite break with John. How did J.C. find his disciples? Why were they 12 in number? Were they, or some of them, his brothers in one of the Essenic sects? How better can we account for their lack of hesitation in laying aside the matters in which they had been employed, immediately joining him? Surely, in the mission to which he felt he had been called, he needed to set up at least a simple organization. And so he used the pattern of the Essenic sects and called to himself from his own sectarian community these men whom he knew, and made them his 12. Whether he himself forsook his community, and if so, when, is a question to which we will come a little further on. There's a story in the Gospels which tell of J.C. disputing the scholars in the temple when he was also 12 years old. Some commentators have thought this story more likely to be legendary than the report of an actual event. But suppose that J.C. was taken when he was a boy, as we know other boys were, to be taught by the masters in one of the Essenic sects. Not only will he learn the canonical scriptures, those that all Jews accepted, but also the sectarian writings with their special point of view. What difficulty is there, then, in seeing J.C. as an unusually responsible student who already had committed many of the scriptures to memory, and who, being cynic, was contending in the temple against the Pharisaic scholars who were fascinated by his use of proof texts and glad to keep him talking so that they could marvel at so much learning in one so young. It may seem as though we are assuming too much in supposing that J.C. was brought up as an Essene, but he was certainly not brought up as a Sadducee. And in view of his hostility to the Pharisees, he is not likely to have been brought up in that sect either. So it was an Essenic sect or nothing. As JC obviously knew the scriptures well, it is impossible that he had not been schooled. We cannot believe then that he belonged to no sect at all. Thus, even by a process of eliminations, we see the strong possibility that his education was Essenic. And as we know from the previous sections, his teaching and his entire outlook relate him to the Essenes. In sending out his disciples on a missionary campaign, JC tells them that they shall go forth by 2 and 2, taking a staff only, no bread, no wallet, no money in their purse. This is Mark chapter 6, verses 7 through 8. How were they to be maintained? Where would they sleep? Who would feed them? In the past, the only answer could be given to these questions was that there were hospitable people in Galilee who would do these things for strangers in a religious message, or else the disciples of JC were unusually well equipped with relations and friends. What now immediately leaps to mind is the suggestion that they were expecting to be received in the Essenic colonies, which we know existed in the cities and the villages, as described by Philo and Josephus. From the Damascus document, too, we learn of the cession of the cities and that there were camps. Since the disciples of JC belonged to the Essenic movement, they were entitled to hospitality in accordance with its rules. But JC anticipates the possibility that they will not invariably be welcome. Not all of the colonies or camps are favorable to JC, perhaps because of his claim to be a prophet. We are leaving out of the account the contested questions as to whether JC, at this point or at any, made a larger claim than this. In the event that the disciples were not received by the colonies, they had instructions from JC as to what to do. And whatsoever place shall not receive you, and they hear you not, as ye go forth thence, shake off the dust that is under your feet for a testimony unto them. Mark 6:11, which in itself is an Essenic flavor. Where did JC spend his 40 days in the wilderness? Perhaps the phrase is metaphorical. Some commentators have thought so, believing that a literal sojourn of several weeks in a deserted place was unlikely. Perhaps they are right, but we see now how they may have been only partly right. JC would not have had to spend those several weeks unsheltered. He could have gone to the monastery in Qumran. He could have lived for a while, as some of the monastics did, in one of the caves. As for fasting, he might have noticed some of the stones that are so abundant in this area and wished that they might be turned to bread. Indeed, it could have been more than a wish. Hunger brings on precisely such hallucinations, and he saw it as a temptation to believe in magic, in his power to perform a miracle, and quoted a verse from the scriptures we knew so well: "Man shall not live by bread alone." A much more controversial hypothesis may be suggested as a new and more illuminating interpretation of the expulsion of JC from Nazareth after he had identified himself as the one predicted by a passage in the book of Isaiah. We will leave to the next section the question of whether Nazareth was an actual city or a much wider area. Luke's gospel merely says that JC came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and he entered, as his custom was, into the synagogue on the Sabbath day. It has usually been assumed that the cities of Palestine at the period there was a synagogue in each city. Of course, all the inhabitants who wished to do so made use, both for Sabbath worship and for instruction in religion. This may indeed have been the case, but we do not know the origin of the synagogue, as shrouded in obscurity. Even the name itself involves questions that it would take many pages barely to outline. In Greek, the word synagogue is Greek, not Hebrew or Aramaic. The primary meaning is an assembly rather than a building. There is, of course, a Hebrew word that the Greek word translates, but this too means an assembly, originally for any purpose, but eventually almost always for religious purposes. The question that arises, however, in the context of the story in Luke's Gospel, chapter 4, verses 16 to 30, is whether the general synagogue, if such existed, was not a meeting place of the Pharisees. It was they who developed the synagogue as the word is usually construed. Did Essenes attend the Pharisaic synagogue, or did they make their own quite independent provisions? Everything we know from the scrolls indicates the latter. So does what we know about the Essenic sects from the other sources. If Essenes and Pharisees observed the Sabbath together in a common place of worship, the fact is so remarkable that it will revise considerably our view of the relationships between the Jewish sects. Where then did J.C. go when he went to the synagogue? Was it to the synagogue of the Pharisees? It seems hardly likely. He was sharply opposed to the Pharisees and criticized them freely. In the plight of our new knowledge, linking him so definitely to the Essenic sects, it is all but certain that he went to the meeting place of the Essenic order between the very community where, to use Luke's language, he was brought up. In this case, the synagogue was not a building so designated, but an assembly, a Sabbath meeting of the many. May we not suppose then that he belongs still to this community, and having become widely known as a teacher, it was appropriate that the many should desire to hear him, and consequently had a scroll of Isaiah delivered to him so that he could read and expound it. The passage Jay-Z chose from the 61st chapter, 1 and 2. The Spirit of the Most High is upon me, because he has anointed me to preach good tidings to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives, and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty them that are bruised, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Most High. This prophecy, said J.C., when he had given back the scroll to the intendant, was there and then being fulfilled. The assembly marveled at the excellence of his exposition. Presently, however, having warned them that he did not expect them to believe him, since a prophet is never acceptable in his own country, he told them that he himself was the anointed, who was fulfilling the Isaiah prophecy. To the assembled many, this was blasphemy, and they hastened to cast him forth, even trying to throw him down headlong from the precipitous place at the brow of the hill, but he managed to escape them. Was this the rejection of J.C. by his own sect? Is it an indication of what he meant when he warned his disciples that some of the Essenic colonies might not receive them, and what he had in mind when he had lamented that there were places where he could do nothing because of unbelief? As we shall see later, no matter what the case was with the Essenic and early Christian communities, J.C., as the Gospels depict him, besides giving evidence of belonging to an Essenic order, also shows many signs of independence, and even of being critical of certain Essenic practices. None of the above is set forth as a short exegesis. All that is intended is the implication of our new insights to events that may become more meaningful if we can learn to see them in a clearer context. Any one hypothesis may be set up only to be knocked down by further information or clear perception, but it then becomes possible to erect a better hypothesis, and this is what scholars should be doing. One of the most perplexing of the New Testament problems is the question of how it came to be that the Jerusalem church was ruled by James the Just. What happened to the original 12 as such, we do not know, although we know something of the activities of a few of them, such as Peter. Peter himself, however, although an influential figure among the Jerusalem apostles, was less so than James the Just. The latter seems to have had his own 12 and to have arrived at the superintendency of the Jerusalem church with no association with JC during the time of his ministry. He is said to have been the brother of JC, but this has led to many difficulties, such as the doctrinal one of maintaining the perpetual virginity of Mary, and the historical one of explaining how James acquired a position which JC and the Gospels seem to have given to Peter. Moreover, we learn from the church father Eusebius, quoting Hegesippus, circa 160 A.D., that James was holy from his mother's womb, drank no wine, nor strong drink, nor ate animal food, nor a razor came to his head, nor did he anoint himself with oil, nor use the bath. To him only was it permitted to enter the holy cities. His knees became hard like a camel's, because he was always kneeling in the temple, asking forgiveness for the people. The description here is that of a Nazarite. Why did Mary dedicate James from his mother's womb to Nazaritic austerities and do less than that for JC? Let us, since we cannot answer the question, accept the assertion. But there is a much harder question. How could James enter the Holy of Holies, which the high priest himself was only permitted to enter once a year? Moreover, what does it mean that he kneels in the temple, constantly asking forgiveness for the people? Was it because he saw in James too dangerous a rival that the high priest Ananus had him assassinated, for which he was disposed by Agrippa II? That the community over which James resided did spend a good deal of time in and about the temple is attested, apparently by the story of Paul and the riot that occurred there, incited by the charge that Paul was no longer a faithful Jew. Eusebius also quotes a lost book of Clement of Alexandria, the Institutions, in which Clement writes that Peter and James and John, after the ascension of their Savior, though they had been preferred by the Most High, did not contend for the honor, but chose James the Just as Bishop of Jerusalem. From this it would seem that the three who had been closest to JC felt unequal to the situation that confronted them after his death, or that they came to feel so after a time, and nominated James to be the superintendent of the community in which they were most natural leaders. But what was the community over which James presided? His prestige was evidently very great, and with a large number of people. The title, the just, the righteous, is definitely an acidic variety, and even reminds us of the teacher of righteousness. Even if the chronology allowed it, James would have to be seriously considered as the one to whom this name was given. But he would need to have lived in the very least half a century earlier. Even so, he was plainly a man of wide influence among the Jews of the period. It is also clear that he was definitely Judaic. He made certain concessions to Paul so far as the Gentile churches were concerned, but his own community was of Moses' law, Essenically organized and looking for a Messiah. The fuller analysis of the problem of James, Bishop of Jerusalem, could carry us farther afield than is appropriate to the scope of this present work. It is much to be wished that there are scholars in the intrepidity to conduct such an analysis in light of our new knowledge with an objective attitude toward the outcome. But it is in any case clear that the figure of James casts a very wide shadow. Now that we know the Essenic sects and the Christian apostolic community were so extremely close in organization and sacraments and doctrine in the Messianic hope, Must we not ask whether James the Just was the leader of the entire movement? And must we not suppose that the group that had been led by Peter accepted his position as subordinate to James because he was the revered high priest of all the Messianic Jews, the acknowledged head of all these sects that belong to the new covenant? All right, so there's a little bit left in this book, and there's one more section, but here's what I'm trying to get out of this whole review. We former Christians or Christians, we know of the missing years of JC, and it hasn't been well explained in our scrolls or our documents or even the New Testament. I'm not going to call it ours because I'm not a Christian. Anyway, so the point that I'm trying to bring out here is the Essenes, who JC and John the Baptist were a part of. This is one, the reasoning that they knew or were well versed with our scrolls. But two, this book references the baptismal practices, which is not of the Most High. It also referenced the sun worship. And remember, I said that very early on in the beginning of this video, and the last part, the pagan influences of the early Christian movement. So when you add all that up together, and considering all the things that these Christians supposedly stand for, and it's nothing but a face mask for war, murder, thievery of lands, and all those type of things. Knowing all that, how can you think critically and still follow these Christian and Catholic churches? That's my point of this video. And I try to respect all, but the information is pouring out, and it's leading us to a rethinking of all the nonsense that was told to us as we were growing up, because the New Testament is not a covenant for the original Hebrews. The Most High does not change. That's what Malachi 3 says. He does not change. So he already laid out what he wants us to do. So he doesn't need a new covenant. And for those that talk about, well, he came, JC came down and sacrificed himself for our sakes. Well, look at my other series, the Old Testament versus New. I think that's how I have it labeled. But anyway, just check that out. Because the Most High does not believe in human sacrifice. And the shedding of blood, he's against. So why would he do that to his own son? And he's telling us not to do it. Again, you got to think critically. Anyway, guys, I just wanted to, I know it wasn't quick, it was an hour plus, but I wanted to get that out. That's been on my mind, and look forward to some of my upcoming reviews or just thoughts that I have. Like I said, I just want to be a part of this whole movement or awakening, because the Most High told us to search Him, and the only way we can search Him is to seek information about Him, completely about Him. Anyway, again, this is Yahuda Lee, and I'll see you next time.